Awesome, and welcome. We're doing our recording a little bit later. Unfortunately, on Sunday we had some internet problems, and so I'm on my own here redoing the recording from Sunday. Sunday was supposed to be the second episode from the series on Corinthians. Now, as you might or might not know, we're busy with the early writings of Paul because they are quite literally like the earliest writings we have on the Christian faith, even before our Gospels. So they're incredibly important to us to have a look at them from a fresh perspective, knowing they are first and written by Paul, which is an interesting thing because it's a first-hand writing. It's most of Paul's writing. We believe that Paul really wrote these things, and so it's important for us to have a look at what does Paul think early on, and not try to mash up all and create an average of all Paul's writings, or at least all Paul's writing in the New Testament, but have a look at the early writings to see what they look like, what they are saying, what they don't say, which is many times very, very important. So we're in the book of Corinthians, which is one of Paul's earliest writings, quite a longer piece. And the first thing that really strikes us, as with all the other books we've worked through, Galatians and also First Thessalonians, is that it's all about the coming of Jesus. This is the central theme. Everything else is sandwiched in between. Questions of how, when, why, what do we do until he comes, what happens after he comes. It's all about the coming of Jesus. And if you've been with me on this journey, you would know that this type of expectation of the end of the world or the end of the age was something that was in the Jewish consciousness by this time, specifically in the Pharisaical ideas of the apocalypse or the apocalyptic way of thinking, that there's coming an end to the world order, into the evil things, and God's doing something brand new. Now, it seems to me, and I'm just throwing this out there a little bit early, but it does seem to me like Paul is doing a reworking of that expectation. It's kind of like a mashup between the person of Jesus and the ancient Jewish or the old Jewish apocalyptic expectation. And he is bringing the apocalyptic expectation in focus with Jesus at the very center. So that's just quite a quick and wide summary of what we're busy with. But let's pop straight into chapter 2 of First Corinthians. Last week, we quickly had a look at some of the divisions that already existed within the church very, very early on. It's something which we don't really want to talk about too much. We often would like to think that all Christians believe the same from the very beginning, but it's just simply not the way things were. There were differences very early on, and it's only really once we start entering the Catholic era in the 4th century that we start putting creeds together of what exactly people need to believe to be Christian. And that's kind of how it has led us today to be at a place where some people will say that if you don't believe in this, you can't be a Christian. I mean, you can believe in Jesus, you can be a follower of Christ, but if you don't, for instance, if you don't believe in the Trinity exactly like this, then you are not a Christian. If you are not baptized, you are not a Christian. But very early on, there were very many differences, different types of beliefs about Jesus, about the deity of Jesus, and other subjects. Anyway, so let's get into chapter 2 of First Corinthians. Paul starts by saying, guys, I didn't come with wisdom and knowledge of this world to bring you the proof or the testimony or the witness of God. And then he says, I decided before the time, and I'm paraphrasing here, that I was going to know nothing amongst you. I'm going to talk about nothing except Jesus and the fact that he was crucified. So for Paul, it seems like Jesus and him crucified, of course, the resurrection was very important to Paul, is kind of the trigger that allows Paul to think that he truly is at the end of the world. Of course, you would know that the Jewish expectation was of a resurrection, and that would kind of be the main event of this end of the world scenario. People be resurrected. And so I think when Paul had an experience with Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, as he says, excuse me, this was a trigger for him that we're right there now for the first time. I mean, Daniel's been speaking about these things in the book of Daniel for many years, hundreds of years. But now that we've seen Jesus resurrected, he must be the Son of Man that Daniel spoke about. He must be this Messiah figure that's come to change everything. And on top of all of that, he has been crucified, he died, but he is resurrected. And so here I think was a trigger for Paul that if Jesus was resurrected, this is the sign that resurrection, number one, is true, because not all Jews believed in resurrection. The Sadducees did not. So number one, resurrection is true. But number two, this is an indication that we are right, that he was right at the end of all things. And this mass resurrection of those who belong to God was the next thing that was going to take place. And of course, with a little bit of a caveat he mentioned a bit earlier, that those who are alive, they don't need to die to be resurrected, but they'll be transformed. So we spoke about that from there. So the point is that he goes to the Corinthians and he's saying, look, I didn't come trying to be clever. All I did is I tried to tell you that Jesus Christ and him crucified. That's what I'm teaching and preaching to you. In fact, he goes on, he says, I was with you, I was in weakness, I was in fear, I was in much trembling. But I didn't come with enticing words or with man's wisdom, but I came in the demonstration of the Spirit and the power. Now, I know that traditionally for people that grew up in Pentecostal circles, charismatic circles, the demonstration of Spirit and power would mean something like a miracle, performing a miracle, or giving a prophecy, or doing something supernatural. But I think what's really going on here, if you follow from Galatians, the Spirit is about the image and the nature of God being revealed, and the fruit of the Spirit can be summarized by this idea of love. And when he speaks about the power of God, he earlier on in verse chapter 1, he actually says that Jesus Christ crucified is the power of God. Now, this is not only interesting, but it's quite important that we realize when Paul speaks about the power of God, he's talking about the cross, the power of God to resurrect a crucified and killed, murdered Jesus. And so what he is doing in these two verses, he is saying, look, I haven't come to you with great wisdom and excellency of words. I've only come to tell you that God is powerful enough to resurrect Jesus, and that's the token. It's the marker that tells us where we are in terms of worldview, in terms of being at the end of the age. And then Paul starts to speak about this idea that God is going to turn the world on its head. And I think this is an important thing. It's also an important theme for us today. I am still a believer in this idea that the trajectory of humankind with God is ultimately going to be a place where things are on its head. And what we mean by that is the simple sayings of Jesus, like blessed are the poor in Mark, blessed are the merciful, the meek shall inherit the earth. In other words, what we possibly see around ourselves now, and I think it was like this in Paul's time also, is that the strong, they were inheriting everything. Those who were rich, they were blessed. They were economically strong, and they were enjoying the great things in life, and the poor were almost constantly oppressed. And so Paul is putting something before them, and I call this the God is going to put the world on its head. But Paul's words is like this. He says, listen, I did not come to you with wisdom, but my wisdom is not from this world. So I've come to you with wisdom, but the wisdom is not the world's wisdom. Now, the word world here is age. And so we have to understand that many times in the King James Bible, we find the word world, we're really dealing with the word age. In other words, time period. And this is incredibly important because Paul believed that he was at the end of a specific age, and that they were right at that point, and that would usher in the beginning of a new age. But in the new age, there'd be a different wisdom. The world would not physically, but basically flip on its head. The virtue system, the power system, power base would flip on its head. This is how he explains this. He says, no, not the wisdom of this world. In other words, the cleverness of how the world's currently operates, or of the princes of this age. Now, the word princes here, it is a simple word, and it's most normally used for like those who are in power. Bella is making an appearance here. Those who are in power, in other words, those who are in the highest ranks in the earth. For Paul in his day would have been the Romans that basically ruled the known world, also the areas of Jewish interest, of course. And so this is a kind of like, I guess, an indirect reference to them. Some people here would say, no, what he's actually talking about is the demonic powers and princes. I think that primarily Paul is actually talking about the actual government or the actual empirical powers. But I wouldn't put it past him to think of that as a puppet or a mechanism for what Paul believed to be that which is really in control of the world, which is these evil forces, Satan and his demons. Because I think by this time, the demonology of the Jews had developed to a point where this was something that could be understood. And I think if you read a little bit further, by the time you get to the book of Revelation, it's quite clear that whoever wrote the book of Revelation understood or believed that whoever was in power at this time they were just a puppet for the real evil forces, which were spiritual, right? So I would think of this princes of the world as the actual people in charge, but at the same time, I think Paul is referring to something greater and deeper, systems, but ultimately spiritual forces. But the point of verse 6 of 1 Corinthians 6 is that he says that this will come to nothing. And so it seems to us that Paul believed that in this end of the age, end of the world, God was going to bring all of those powerful systems down to nothing. And power will have to be flipped to those who are not powerful. So an upside down type of thing. And for Paul, I think the cross was this upside down idea that God could, through the martyrdom and through the murder of his son, put to shame all these guys who actually murdered him. So it's a flipping of the world, putting the world on its head. But then we get to this idea in verse 7. And in verse 7, we meet the word mystery. Now, if you're an avid reader of Paul, or have been in the church for long enough, you'd know that Paul likes to use the word mystery when he talks about the gospel, when he talks about the good news, and he calls it a mystery. And it's an important point, and I think we need to spend a little bit of time on that. Let me read 1 Corinthians 2, verse 7. It says, but we speak the wisdom of God. So not the wisdom of this age, of this world, of the princes of this world, but we speak the wisdom of God, but it's in a mystery. So the point is that it's not so obvious. And then he adds, he says, it is hidden wisdom. Hidden wisdom. The Greek word here is apokrypto. And apokrypto means, crypto is where we would get our English word cryptic. So it's actually like it's something that was almost seems like purposefully hidden, like you would write a cryptic message, purposefully hidden, mystery. But the point is, as you'll see in a moment, that Paul, for the rest of this chapter, is actually telling us, but it's no longer a mystery for us. It was a mystery to those before us, but now it's no longer a mystery for us. All of this is in context of the context is the end of the world, the end of the age. Now, I need to jump back a little bit to speak a little bit more about the apocalyptic scenario that was part of the Jewish way of thinking. Now, let's just talk about the word apocalyptic. It comes from the Greek word apocalypso, apocalypsis, from apocalypto, meaning to unveil. So as apokrypto means to hide something, apocalypto means to open up that which is hidden. And this is where we get this title for all apocalyptic writing. So basically what you're dealing with is apocalyptic writing are writers that believe that they know the mystery. And what is the mystery? How do we explain this? From what I could research, it kind of goes like this. And you have to go back to the 3rd century BC, to the books of Enoch, Jubilees, the books of Daniel. Before that time, the classical prophets would have thought of the problem of evil in this way? Why is there suffering around us? Why is there pain and suffering around us? And they would normally answer that question. This is from what I can see from early Yahwism and the Torah, early Hebrew writings. It is simply this: when there's pain and suffering, it is because God is punishing those who have done badly, right? Okay, and so that was the first notion of why pain and suffering is in the world. And to some degree, that became a problem. And we see this problem or this tension arising in the book of Job. The book of Job, there's this question: why do good people suffer? Because now it can't be God punishing because they're actually being good. And so this is kind of what the book of Job is really about. It's about the question, it's a theological question. If people are good, why do the good people also suffer? Because if all the evil in the world is simply God's punishment of evil or of disobedience, then why do good people suffer? And so you have in the book of Job, where Job actually stands up for himself and says, no, I haven't done anything wrong, while his friends come and they bring accusation against him, and they actually put in front of him the old theological classical view. You must have done something wrong, Job. Nothing like this happens to people who live perfectly. Yet the narrative of Job tells us that he was perfect, whatever that might have meant. But the point is that Job highlights the tension of two worldviews. The first one is all the evil in the world is because God punishes people who are disobedient, etc., or don't live according to his laws. And the second view that says, no, but that can't be true because good people also suffer. And so it's out from this way of thinking that eventually apocalyptic writing appears. And apocalyptic writing means we have found the mystery, we know why it's like this. In other words, we know, in essence, and I'm doing a very brief summary, but in essence, we know why people suffer, why good people suffer. The answer, simple: God doesn't run the world, evil spirits run the world. They are responsible for the for the bad things that happen to bad people, but also to good people. And so the genre of apocalyptic writing has always got to do with God or the scenario of writing mysteries. And so normally apocalyptic writing is people that get caught up into heaven to see what is really happening. In other words, from a heavenly perspective, what's going on in the world. And one of the first Jewish apocalyptic writings is the book of Enoch. And in the book of Enoch, there's this revelation. Revelation, of course, means apocalypto, apocalypsis. The hidden mystery is revealed. What's really going on is there's demonic powers that's running everything, and they are the ones responsible for all the evil in the world. So this is why I think Paul would use words like apocalypto and also apocrypto. If you remember from the early portions of the book of Galatians, Paul says, I received the gospel, the good news, by the revelation, the apocalypsis of Jesus Christ. In other words, Paul believed that in his experience with the resurrected Jesus, he got a window into the mystery of what's going on, right? And here in 1 Corinthians 2 and in verse 7 and 8 and a little bit further on, he's saying that this mystery was hidden. It wasn't known to everyone, but, and this is almost the theme of the entire second chapter in 1 Corinthians. Go check it out if you read the whole thing. It's almost the main theme of the second chapter is this. It used to be a mystery. Now we know. In other words, we used to not understand, but now we understand. And I think that should be read in context with Paul's understanding of what's about to happen to the world. In other words, there's this mystery that whoever is wise now will not be wise forever. God's wisdom works different to the wisdom of man. The systems of governments and spiritual evil powers, then time is numbered. This is the mystery, that they will eventually be dealt with or will be dealt with quite soon, and God will set up something new and brand new. And so, this is where this genre of apocalyptic writing comes from. If you think about our book, the Revelation of Jesus that we have at the end of our Bible, It's called the apocalypto of Jesus, or the apocalypsis. One is noun, one's verb. But the point is that the writer is trying to say we got the mystery down. And in some ways, it's a further development of what Paul is actually saying really early on here. But what's the point of all of this? Well, it seems like Paul believed that Jesus gave him insight into the mystery of what is going on and how things are going to end. And that nobody really understood it fully before. Now we know that Paul was, to some degree, we could show, I think it's possible to show that Paul was influenced by his Jewish roots, his Pharisaical ideas, the ideas of Enoch and Jubilees, of course, the book of Daniel. But Paul goes further, and Paul takes that background of this mystery that they believe they had insight into, and he brings it into focus, focusing on Jesus as the center of this, as the Messiah, as the Son of Man, as him coming again, and him affecting this flipping of the world on its head. And I think that's a very good way to contextualize Paul's beliefs. I think to read Paul and think that he wrote for us today, 2023, and that everything he is saying is got to do with us, and is really to take him out of his context, and you actually lose the power of, or the essence of what Paul is really trying to say. So let's read, let me read verse 7, 8, and a little bit of 9, now that I've given a little bit of context on that. So he says, but we speak the wisdom of God in a mystery that was hidden, apocrypto, which God ordained before the world unto our glory. So in other words, this mystery has always been there, but nobody could ever see it. And the end of it is our glory. If you've read Paul enough, you know that Paul's always toying with this idea of the glorification of people. I'm not sure if the other writers really, well, Paul's really like the main writer of the New Testament, but Paul's always speaking about many sons to glory, that there's a glory awaiting us. Christ in you, the hope of glory. And what exactly that means is, it's an interesting thought, but I think, once again, thinking in terms of what this initial idea would have been. It would have been the reality that was coming, that humans would become immortal, that there'd be a resurrection that would take place, or a transformation for those who are alive, and that they'd be glorified. In other words, they would become, they would take on like a spiritual body, a glorified body, and so become immortal, and so enjoy the kingdom of God for the rest of their lives. I think it's the best way to probably look at that. Verse 8, which none of the princes of this world knew, or the princes of this age knew, for if they had known, they would not have crucified the Lord of this glory. In other words, he's saying that if they just knew who Jesus was, he's the Lord of this glory. Now, that would mean, excuse me, first and foremostly, he's the first participant in this glorification or transformation. Jesus died and then resurrected. First fruits, as he is called in other places. If they had known that the whole world to come is actually going to be under the rulership of this transformed, resurrected Jesus, and that many will follow in the same way, they would never have killed him. What's the point? It's a mystery. Nobody understands and nobody knows about this. For if they had known, they wouldn't have crucified him. All right, now we get to verse 9. And verse 9, I want to slow down a little bit. Paul is quoting from Isaiah here, and I want to spend a bit of time on this quotation from Isaiah. Let me just say this before we do this. If you had ever spent a bit of time on Paul's quotations from the Old Testament, you would know that Paul is many times taking things out of its original context. He does this not to mislead, or I think not to mislead, I wouldn't say that, but it is, number one, as far as I understand, it was kind of the practice of the Pharisees, or of the Jews at least at that time, to be able to take ancient scripture and reinterpret them in their immediate context. I think there was more a practice than what we allow for that today, or at that time or later in Christian circles. So that's the first thing we must realize. But it does seem quite obvious to me that Paul goes back into the Old Testament and takes pieces of scripture that in the Old Testament context where they are found, they mean something else and are used for something else. And he drags them across into the New Testament and he applies them to his worldview. Now, we would say, and I think my initial, my old way of thinking would immediately say, but it's because Paul has this revelation. In other words, by that I'm saying that we kind of believed, and some still believe, and I'm not sure where I am completely on this, but that Paul, because he has this revelation of Jesus, he's allowed to do this. In other words, he's allowed to take the Old Testament and twist it and turn it and place it in a brand new context, meaning something else, leave parts out, change words. He's allowed to do that because he has the revelation of Jesus. He has this mystery that was unfolded to him and nobody else. So I think that's kind of the excuse we would normally go with. And I'm not here to say this way or that way. I just want to make the point that Paul doesn't just quote word for word when he pulls out from the Old Testament. He changes things, he reapplies them. It's almost like you get the feeling that Paul thinks that those who wrote these prophecies didn't know what they were talking about. They didn't know the real meaning of the prophecies. He knows the real meaning. And that is a pattern we see unfold throughout all the development of scripture and theology. But let's go to this example. So let me read for you verse 9 of 1 Corinthians chapter 2. It says, "But as it is written, eye has not seen, nor ear heard, neither has entered into the heart of man the things which God has prepared for them that love him." Okay, so the context of this is God's going to flip the world on its head. This is inside that end of the world scenario. And what comes after that is so amazing that nobody has ever thought about this. Nobody has ever seen it. It hasn't even entered into people's thoughts or the heart of the man. The things which God has prepared, in other words, the plan God has, this hidden mystery that nobody's ever heard, seen, or this, once again, this is telling us it's a mystery. And this is especially for those people who love God. In other words, by this time, it's still obvious to me that if we take Paul seriously and try and take him in context, he doesn't believe that everyone's going to get this great kingdom of God. It does seem like he believes there's an elect, a called group that love God, I think is the terminology he's using here. They will inherit this beautiful thing. So let's now go to the place where this is quoted from. And we're going to spend a couple of minutes there. This is from Isaiah 64 and verse 6. And I'm going to read you, there's two versions of this verse. The first one is the one that's found in I have the old King James version. And let me read it for you. And you might have to go check it out yourself to see how the differences become noticeable. But here it goes. It says, "For since the beginning of the world, men have not heard, nor perceived by the ear, neither has the eye seen, O God, beside thee, what he has prepared for him that waits for him." Okay, there's a lot of things going on here, but you'll immediately notice there's no entering into the heart. The other thing here is there's this portion of "O God, beside thee," which doesn't really make sense in this rendition of it. And there's no mention of those who love him. It is those who wait for him. Okay. So another version of this, and you can, if you have the old King James, there's a little thingy there, and you go 4a, and if you jump across in your notes section or your footnotes section, it reads like this. So let me read this again, the different version, and I think this version actually makes better sense. "For since the beginning of the world, men have not heard, nor perceived by ear, neither has any eye seen a God besides thee, which does so for him that wait for him." And so here this, in my view, this makes a lot more sense. It puts "besides" into context. And basically what the writer is saying, that nobody has ever seen these great things that nobody has seen and heard, that only God and no other God does for people that wait on him. All right, so there you have it. So the question is, what is the context of Isaiah 64, verse 4? And so just briefly, I mean, you can go read from around Isaiah 63 and into 65, but this is the third part of Isaiah, which is written more or less at the time of the return from exile. Jerusalem lies in absolute ruins. It's built, it's burnt down. You can read the latter portion of chapter 64. It says, Zion is a wilderness, Jerusalem is a desolation. And so it's probably written in the time, late 6th century, when when Jerusalem is lying as a waste, right? And this writer now is calling on God to do something about it. And so if you read from verse 1, it's beautiful language. I'm going to read it for you, 64 verse 1. Oh, that you, talking to God, that you would rend the heavens, that you would come down. Right? So this is about a coming, right? He wants him to come. That the mountains might flow down at thy presence. What does this mean? The mountains will flow down. He actually explains. He says, as when the melting fire burns. Now, melting fire flowing down from a mountain, that's lava, right? We're talking about a volcanic eruption. The fire that causes the waters to boil. That's what happens when boiling lava running down from a mountain hits the ocean, right? The water starts boiling. To make your name known to your adversaries, that the nations might tremble at your presence. And so, in other words, the writer 64 Isaiah is writing, calling on God to open up the heavens. Very old language, yeah, like open up the heavens and come down. Like God was going to come down. But but the manifestation of this is a volcanic eruption of some mountain and lava running and burning and fire and the waters boil. So maybe Isaiah is writing this metaphorically. I'm not sure, but he's calling, or he was writing, it probably wasn't Isaiah that wrote this portion, but he's calling for God to do something, to make himself known, to make his power visible, because Israel has lost. Israel's God has lost in the eyes of the other nations, because Israel and Jerusalem is absolutely laid waste. Verse 3 says, when you did terrible things which we looked not for, you came down, the mountains flowed down at thy presence. And then, for since the beginning of the world, have man not heard, nor perceived by ear, etc., etc. So what's the context of Isaiah 64? It's this: Jerusalem is destroyed. And the writer of Isaiah 64 is calling for God to come down and do something about this horrible defeat we've suffered. Do terrible things, like a mountain that erupts with lava and makes the waters boil and burns everything in its wake. Come down and do something. So Paul takes this from Isaiah 64, which has got to do with Jerusalem, the restoration of a natural temple, natural people, natural city and area. And he pulls it out of that context and he says, oh, no, give it to me. I'm going to do something else with it. And he places it in an apocalyptic setting. And he changes some stuff. He leaves some stuff out. And at the end, Paul's one doesn't sound like judgment, like in a bad thing. It's actually just, guys, you've never seen what God's going to do for us because we love him. So, I mean, it's a lot of information, but it does give you an idea of how Paul used the Old Testament. I mean, of course, Paul didn't have our Hebrew version of the New Testament that me and you have, that was translated from the Hebrew. Paul probably used the Septuagint, which was a Greek version, but I had a look at that, and that's very similar to the Hebrew version. So what Paul writes here is quite an adaptation. But the point is that Paul goes and grabs some old prophecy and uses it, he refocuses it onto this apocalyptic expectation. He's saying, like, no ears ever heard, no one's ever seen, people haven't even thought. And that's an addition. Paul adds it. He says as it is written, but he adds stuff into it. So it gives us an idea of how he used the scriptures, but what God's going to do for those who love him. So that's how he does it. But what is the point of Paul pulling this across into the New Testament? Paul is trying to tell the Corinthians, guys, you have no idea how great this is going to be when this mystery plays itself out. It's going to be amazing. The second point is, and that he makes from verse 10 onward, he says, it's no longer a mystery to us. We actually know what's coming. And the point he makes is because we've received the Spirit of God. Because we've received the Spirit of God, And I think by that he means for himself. I've received a revelation of Jesus. Jesus explained to me how this is going to work, what the mystery looks like, and what's really going to happen. We know what's going on. So verse 10 says, but God has revealed these things unto us by his Spirit. In other words, the verse, no eyes seen, nor ears heard, is no longer valid, because Paul believes we now know. He says he has apocalypto it. He has revealed them to us by his Spirit. For the Spirit searches all things, yes, the deep things of God. For what man knows the things of a man, except the spirit of a man which is in him? He's making the case that the Spirit of God knows what's up with God, and it's that Spirit that God has given us. And I think primarily is talking about himself, but also by extension everybody else. In other words, he feels like he's the vessel that opens up the mystery, and now everybody else can see what's coming and what's going on. He goes on to say the natural man can't receive the things of the Spirit of God. They're foolish, like the cross and resurrection is absolute foolishness to the Greeks, he would normally say, but in this case, he says they are foolishness unto him. Neither can they know him, because they are spiritually discerned. So Paul's making the case that what is about to happen in this world, the flipping of the world on its head, is a spiritual thing. Spiritual people understand what's coming. It's going to be a flipping on its head, but for the spiritual people, it's going to be so great. The things God will do for those who love him, and nobody's ever thought about this. Nobody's ever even conceived it. Nobody's ever seen it. Nobody's ever heard about it. Nobody's ever thought about it. But now the point of this portion is, but now we are seeing it. Now we are hearing it. Now we are thinking about it. And I think maybe Paul is indirectly referring here to what we saw, what he believes he saw in Jesus, that Jesus went through cross, martyrdom, and death, but now resurrected. He saw him, he heard him, and as Jesus, as an example, now has shown us what this new world will be like, and how great the power of God is through what other people consider the foolishness of the cross. And then verse 15, he that is spiritual judges all things, yet he is judge of no man. I don't think this is about a spiritual person judging a non-spiritual person. I think what is really at stake here is that spiritual things cannot be understood or judged by the natural things. And this is one of the important things that we've picked up in Paul, and maybe something that Paul has different to his Jewish predecessors, his apocalyptic predecessors, who, as far as we know, were looking for a bodily resurrection, like in terms of like literally the corpse coming alive. But Paul seems to never really put any emphasis on a bodily resurrection. Paul would say things like flesh can't inherit this kingdom, and Paul makes a point of telling us at some point, and we'll get to that at some other point, but that people that are resurrected get a spiritual body. So it seems to us that Paul is convinced to some degree that whatever is coming, this new world, this new age, is a spiritual thing. It's a spiritual reality. By that, he's not saying we're going flying off somewhere else. He's just saying that things here are rebirthed and made new into a spiritual way that is immortal, etc. Verse 16, and I'm going to end with verse 16 today, is an interesting one, because I've used this portion of scripture so much, and always out of context. And I think, like, for the first time in my life, I'm actually reading this in the proper context. Here it is. You'll know it. For who has the mind of the Lord? And he's talking about Jesus, right? He calls him Lord, Kurios, that he may instruct him. But we have the mind of Christ. So, in context, I don't think Paul is here saying we think exactly like Jesus, and we know that's not true. Me and you know that's not true of our lives. I don't think exactly like Jesus. I have some bad thoughts, which I hope Jesus would not have thought. But the point is, the context is concerning what God has prepared, concerning what God has prepared for those who love him. We have received the mind of Christ by receiving the Spirit of God. And so this whole chapter 2 is about telling the Corinthian church, guys, it used to be a mystery of what was coming for those who love God, but it's no longer a mystery. We now know, because we have the Spirit of God, we know what's coming. We know there's glory coming. Um, and we understand because we have the understanding. Maybe it's better to say we have the understanding that Jesus has because we've received it by revelation. I think that's what's going on in chapter 2 of First Corinthians. That Paul is telling them God's going to flip the world on its head, and don't worry, it's going to be good for those who love God. It's going to be amazing. Nobody's ever thought, seen, and he pulls out from Isaiah 44. Uh, nobody's ever thought about it. Nobody's ever seen it. It hasn't even entered the heart of a person. But we have heard about it now. You have received it now. We do have the mind of Christ because we have the Spirit of God. And God has revealed to us what's going to happen at the end of this age. And so this is one of Paul's very, very strong polemics uh, to get the church excited about what he believed was imminently happening in his time, that the apocalyptic expectation of his forefathers had finally arrived. The proof for Paul, I think, was the resurrection of Jesus. And that was different from all the other apocalyptic writers, because they would write, Daniel would write about a resurrection in the book of Daniel. Maybe people like the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls, they had apocalyptic expectation, resurrection. The Pharisees believed in resurrection, but it was only once Paul said Jesus was resurrected with Paul, I think the penny dropped. This is the time right now. We who are alive and remain will be transformed. Those who are dead, they're going to get resurrected, but we who are alive and remain any moment now, next Thursday, or maybe 2 weeks from now. I think that's what was going on at this point. Um, so in our next session, we want to speak about the day of the Lord and fire. That's what we find in chapter 3, and we'll see how that blends into the next portions. Thanks so much for walking with me on this journey. I hope it's helping. I hope it's creating a large picture of how these books fit. And it's been very, very helpful to me, and I'm so thankful for taking this journey, and I hope that you would find some benefit in this too. Thanks so much. See you guys next time. Cheers.